everyone. My name is Tara Lynn Hughes, Senior Vice President with TD Bank. We're so proud at TD to be the presenting sponsor of Conversations at the Royal. This speaker series is about bringing critical mental health tools, resources, and care to people in need. Never has this been more important. Living through a pandemic has put challenges in front of Canadians that we've never experienced. And every day at TD, I can see it's testing the mental health and emotional well-being of our employees, our customers, and our communities. That's why conversations around wellness and mental health must be a priority. As always, the Royal Ottawa Foundation is standing tall, and I want to thank them for organizing this important series of virtual monthly events. I believe the Royal and TD share common goals, and that's to advance better health and contribute to open, inclusive, respectful, and dignified conversations that promote recovery and break down stigma. Today and every day, we'll continue to stand together, support each other, and be resilient as we move forward in 2021. On behalf of all of us at TD, thank you for your support and for participating in these very meaningful conversations. Take care, everyone, and be well.
All right. Well, Tara Lynn, thank you very much for that. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Conversations at the Royal. You just heard this is all presented by our very good friends at TD. And you know, we couldn't be doing this series. We started this series. It's amazing how time flies, isn't it? It's been almost a year. It was January that we started Conversations at the Royal, just kind of in the throes of the pandemic. And, you know, during that time, we've had really, I think, thousands of people from across North America drop in, learn a little bit about mental health and anxiety and stress and some of the things that we're dealing with during the pandemic. And we certainly wouldn't be sitting here without the help of the TD Bank. So thank you so much for kicking us off tonight. And if you haven't been with us for one of these segments, first of all, by the way, my name is Ian Mendes. I'm a longtime sports reporter here in Ottawa. Fortunate enough to work as a sports writer right now for The Athletic. But tonight I've taken off the sports hat and putting on the hat of somebody who's just here to learn a little bit more about things like PTSD, anxiety in people that have served our country. And that's going to be the theme of the evening tonight. Now, if you have not been with us for one of these sessions that I've been talking about since January, I want to run you through this because I know a lot of you are like, oh, no. I know Zoom and I know, Microsoft Office and all Teams and all this stuff. Well, you may not be familiar with this particular platform here, the Green Room and the Brand Live folks. So here's what we want you to look at. Okay, a couple of things. On your screen, you're going to see kind of a comment section there on the right-hand side of your screen. That's where we want at the end of the session tonight. Drop your questions in. We got 3 terrific guests coming your way. And I'm sure at the end of these conversations that I have, you're going to be sparked with a question or two. Drop it in. That's what the chat feature is there for. Give us some feedback. Give us some questions. And at the end of the show tonight, in the final 15 minutes or so, close to 8 o'clock Eastern time, we'll get to those. Sometimes things get a little bit laggy, right? On Zoom and this platform is no different. So if you find that that's the case, you're like, oh, this is happening and it's kind of lagging, don't fret. Kind of a normal thing. Just hit F5, okay? F5 on your keyboard, that should do the trick. And the last thing I kind of want to tell you about is at the very bottom of your screen there, you're going to see some kind of additional information, okay? So these are little tidbits, bios about our guests that are joining us. So there's a lot to take in here, and we want to make this as informative and kind of as insightful and as engaging for you. But I think it really helps when you know the platform. So without further ado, like I said, tonight in the next hour or so, we're going to have 3 guests in total. 2 of them are going to be experts from the Royal and a special community leader joining us as well. And I think what I like about this is that each volunteer, speaker that's volunteering their time here tonight is going to share their story, share their expertise. We're so grateful for this. And if you're wondering why the theme of this is kind of dedicated to our veterans, it's because, hey, listen, it's November, and I know south of the border, it's a big day. It's Thanksgiving for them, but 2 weeks ago, it was a big day for us. It was November the 11th. It was Remembrance Day, and I think sometimes in this country we're guilty of all of our focus, right? We wear the poppies November 1st to November 11th. What do? Make sure your jacket's got the poppy. Make sure your sweater has the poppy. And then it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, isn't it? From the 12th of November onwards. And I think that's what we want to do, is just understand that the women and men that have served our country, they've been so dedicated, they need our support year round. It can't just be a one-day thing. And so beyond that, this is what we really want to talk to you about today, is something that's really neat. And this is in conjunction with the Royal, because obviously veterans, they need support. Their families, they need support. So there's a little bit of a solution that was found here. And we're going to tell you a little bit about something called the Center of Excellence on PTSD. PTSD, if you don't know, is post-traumatic stress disorder and related mental health conditions. So we want to talk to you about this because this Center of Excellence is located at the Royal. It's kind of an independent organization. So funded through Veterans Affairs Canada, and they're working with CAF, so the Armed Forces, RCMP veterans, allowing their families to have access to this type of mental health services that I think a lot of them need. And this is a changing field, right? Like all the time, information is coming in. We're getting new information, understanding that kind of up-to-date evidence can shift the way that we treat people. So the resources are there at their fingertips. And we want to bring in our first guest of the evening here to help us learn a little bit more about the Center of Excellence on PTSD and related mental health conditions. Fardous Hosseiny is going to join us here. He is the Deputy CEO of the aforementioned Center of Excellence. We're going to bring him in to the mix here. There we go. It's the old two-shot here for us. So there we go. First of all, good evening, Fardous. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having us on. Yeah, and really excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, and it is. And it's an important conversation, and it's one that I think hopefully we can come out of this with a little bit of a better understanding. So I kind of gave a little bit of a tease to our viewers here tonight about the Center of Excellence. Can you maybe walk us through, like, what's the role, what's the goal, what's the mission, Fardous, of the Center of Excellence on PTSD?
Yeah, thank you for highlighting our work, Ian, and to the Royal and TD. But the Center is a fairly new organization, and we like to call ourselves an intermediary organization. So one that's been created to fill an implementation gap. And in the area of veterans and their families' mental health, there's currently a gap between the knowledge and practice. And the way we want to fill that gap is through our 4 functions. So the first is the way we do that is through conducting research, really advancing new knowledge in the field of veteran and their families' mental health. So what are some of the research questions that veterans and their families want addressed, and how can we support them with solving those important questions? Currently, we have about 30 research projects with our various partners across the country and internationally. The second way is through mobilizing that knowledge. So there's nothing worse than conducting great research and then having it sit on a shelf somewhere. So how can we ensure that research gets to the audience in the right vehicle at the right time in the right form? So how do we leverage all the existing great information that's already out there but might not be accessible to veterans and their families? So our role at the center is really making it easy for them to find our website, click once and find all the information they need. So we want to create that one-stop shop for them. Our third function is really coaching and training. So we want to work with the many amazing healthcare providers across the country to help them with support and development of the best evidence-informed practices and care, because they're offering those direct services to veterans and their families. And we want to make sure that we can equip them with the most up-to-date, highest quality forms of care. And then the fourth is really convening. It's bringing people together to develop collaborative solutions. And the way we've done that is by building a network of network. And this network of network model values lived and living experience and expertise equally with technical expertise. And our work is only possible through collaboration with co-creating efforts. And we want to ensure veterans and their families are not only at the table, but they're leading those discussions. And that's where we want to invest a lot of money in convening and collaborating and bringing those individuals to the conversation.
I like that network of networks. I like that. That's a good way of kind of just talking about how everything is kind of interconnected there. Now, you talked about some of the research projects, Fardous, and I think there's 30 plus of them. Listen, we could probably spend the entire hour talking about this, but I got to give you the opportunity to maybe pick one or two. Like, is there any research-based projects that you want to highlight in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just so much, and we've heard so much from veterans and their families about the different topic areas and why they're important. But when we first started up the organization, we heard from many veterans that spoke to their experience and acknowledged that they may be struggling with something called moral injury instead of PTSD. So the center put their stake in the ground and said, this is an area that we'll further explore, and that's through our research work. So I did want to highlight, what moral injury is, and this is a concept that was coined by clinical psychiatrist Dr. Jonathan Shea to really capture the experiences of military members and veterans whose mental health and other issues were similar to, but did not meet the criteria for PTSD. And the way he described it was moral injury is a betrayal of what is right by someone who holds legitimate authority in a high stakes situation. And people have built on that definitions, and currently a recent review found 17 slight different definitions, but the one that's most agreed upon, the one that's most cited, is that moral injury is the psychological, social, and spiritual consequences of events that seriously violate core moral beliefs and expectations. And there's two broad types of moral transgression events. So the number one is moral transgressions that involve people doing or failing to do things themselves. So this can be deliberate or unwittingly. And the second is being exposed directly or indirectly to transgressions on the part of someone else. So witnessing an event that you don't agree with. And these events are called potentially morally injurious events. And the word potentially is used because it's recognition that not everyone responds the same way to an event. Just as in trauma, you might see a potentially traumatic event, but you might not respond to it just like anyone else. But moral injury is a construct that we've heard a lot of folks and a lot of veterans speak to because they were put in situations where they wanted to intervene or they wanted to do something, but the rules of engagement didn't allow for it. And there's that sense of shame, guilt, and betrayal. And PTSD doesn't really have those similar symptoms.
I'll be honest with you, Fardous. I had never heard up until earlier today or earlier this week when I had kind of looked at this rundown. I'll be honest with you, I had never heard of the term moral injury. And like you said, it's kind of a relatively new term in our lexicon here. Like I've heard of PTSD, and you kind of touched on a little bit some of the differences, but like when it comes to moral injury, like are there specific symptoms that somebody that might be watching this that might have a family member or a friend or a colleague or somebody that they're like, ooh, I wonder if they're suffering from a moral injury. What are some of the symptoms or signs that people should be watching for when it comes to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And moral injury is really getting a lot of attention right now because of our healthcare workers are put in situations where their moral code or they're being put in situations where they're being put in dilemmas where they don't agree with certain things. So that's why there's a lot of attention on this construct. But it started in the military and veteran population. And there are some similarities between PTSD and moral injury, and they overlap. So, they both involve an extremely stressful event. They both involve re-experiencing events. Negative thoughts about yourself, others in the world, and negative emotions and feeling detached from others. But there are some key differences, and this is why there's need for more research in this space. But the first is, as I mentioned, the emotional reaction. So guilt and shame, you might see that in PTSD, but you see more fear, anxiety, sense of horror, sense of helplessness. But guilt and shame are central to the understanding of moral injury. So guilt, shame, and betrayal. When you look at the etiology and the origin, events that lead to PTSD usually involve threat to safety or physical integrity and threat of death, but that's not the same for moral injury. This is one of those situations where you can't intervene when you'd like to, or you witness something that you don't agree with, but it's not really a threat to your safety or physical integrity. And then, this physiological stress, so symptoms of exaggerated arousal, which is commonly seen in individuals struggling with PTSD, you might not see that, or it's not really associated with moral injury. So there are some key differences, but this is an area that needs further exploration, further research, and I like just putting the attention and spotlight on it because we've heard from a lot of veterans, it's like, I've been struggling with this for many years. I just didn't have a name for it.
Yeah, and exactly. And we talk about things shifting and evolving. This is a great example of something that may not have been in the vocabulary a few years ago, and now it is. And now we're seeing, the corresponding and appropriate treatment for that. As we wrap this up here, Fardous, I just want to ask you again, like I said, we probably could have spent the entire hour with you and just learning a little bit more about moral injury and what you're doing over there at the Royal. But is there anything else that you want to say for our audience here in closing, maybe one little kind of takeaway for them here?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge how important it is to really have, these open and honest conversations. And as we continue to name and highlight some of the struggles our veterans and their families are facing, it's important to create that space. And without acknowledging or building awareness, on these important issues, we've missed the mark. And as you know, many of us know that we've done a lot of great work to chip away at the stigma, but it still exists. And if we can name it and make it part of the dialogue and discourse, then we haven't done our job. So I want to thank you just for having this conversation, this dialogue.
Yeah, listen, I appreciate it, and you know what, Fardous, will certainly keep you around. And I know that there might be some people watching this evening that might have some follow-up questions about moral injury or some of the things you just discussed, and we want to invite you again. Okay, so in the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes, as we're having this conversation, if anything that Fardous said or anything that my next guest is going to say, by all means, just jump into the chat, drop us a question, we'll get to it at the end of the show. So Fardous, thanks so much for that. And now it's time, as I said, we have 3 guests tonight, so we're going to move into our middle guest here. And I'd like to introduce everybody on this Thursday evening to Peter Winfield. And Peter is a 25-year veteran, former Army officer who basically worked in everything from, I think, infantry to counterterrorism, overseas deployments on numerous occasions. And Peter is nice enough to join us. He was diagnosed with PTSD, anxiety, severe depression after his last deployment, and his treatment began at the Operational Stress and Injury Clinic at the Royal. And I can't thank you enough, Peter, for taking the time and having this conversation. Like, I hope you understand, how brave you are. I mean, listen, bravery is something that comes probably with your job, but this is a whole different type of bravery. We really appreciate you opening up here with us here on this TD conversation event with the Royal.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. I don't know about bravery. I'm feeling like I've got my lungs have sort of reached up here right now. So, but yeah, thank you for taking the time and showing the interest even after Remembrance Day.
Yeah, and I think it's important. And I think, listen, my job here in the next few minutes is to kind of help you out here and kind of just explain to our audience kind of what you've dealt with and kind of how you've gotten to this point today. So maybe, look, I mentioned more than 2 decades with the armed forces. Maybe you could just talk to us a little bit, Peter, about your role and years of service with the Canadian Army.
Well, sure. I mean, first of all, thank you. You've done a pretty good job of outlining it. So, I started off in university. I was here studying at Carleton in Ottawa, and I joined the Infantry Reserves. And really, that's where it all started. A few years, after I finished school, I joined the regular Army as an armor officer. Armor, for those of you who don't know, that's tanks. And not long after that, I switched over to the business of intelligence and worked on counterterrorism. Altogether, I deployed 3 times. That includes Bosnia and Afghanistan. And the thing is, during my time on the job, I was exposed to a very wide variety of trauma, the kinds that most people might expect from the military, like training accidents, as well as the sort of operational traumas overseas that you'd expect. But there's another sort of second cousin some people think of in terms of trauma, which is secondary or vicarious trauma. And this is where you have secondary experience through detailed reports or interviews, graphic videos, photos, and recordings of things like kidnappings, as an example. So without getting into any of the details, because I don't think we want to get into that here, that's in a nutshell how I spent the last 25 years.
So I think, Peter, what people would love to know from you, what encouraged you? And look, I've had this conversation with men all the time. Look, it just seems like as men, we don't like to talk about our problems. We don't like to talk about our issues. I would imagine that is something that is certainly prevalent in your realm. Sometimes people look at it as a sign of weakness, and these are the conversations we need to have to understand, like, hammer home the message. This isn't weakness. This is the epitome of bravery. And I want you to maybe talk to me a little bit about, like, what was there one event? Was there something that was a catalyst that encouraged you, Peter, to say, you know what, I need some help and I need to understand where I'm at mentally?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you pointed out that especially among men, it's difficult for us to talk about these things. But I would add another one, which is that a lot of times, at least in the world where I worked, a lot of the things that you might sort of identify as flags for PTSD, like anger, for example, they're sort of normalized, so you might not recognize it. But here, let me tell you. There are a lot of resources available for people like me who need help with their mental health. The thing is, though, I didn't really know much about them at the time. And more than that, I probably wouldn't have reached out on my own. So I have to say I'm forever grateful to a very good friend of mine who sought help for his own PTSD and recognized the signs in me. So it was due to a friend who prompted me to make the phone call. And I eventually found myself at, as you mentioned, the OSI clinic at the Royal. So really, it's for me, it's friends looking out for friends. And I also think this is a big reason why peer support programs are so important and so powerful. It's also the reason why there's a lot of support for caregivers, because it's a lot of times it's our friends and our family, the people close to us, who notice that when something isn't right before we do. That's certainly my case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you highlighted, A, your friend who helped, but B, the caregivers, because I can only imagine you come home from a deployment and there's a lot to unpack there, emotionally, mentally, and sometimes our friends and colleagues, or in your case, your friends, your colleagues, your family are the ones who are dealing with it. So I'm really glad that you went out of your way to point that out, Peter. How would you say, and I know this might be an overly simplistic question, so I apologize for that, but how would you say, Peter, how would you say that your life has changed since the diagnosis?
Well, that's a tough question, because it was slow. And I think, as my life was changing, I probably didn't realize anything was happening. The thing is, early on, it took me a very long time to accept not only that I had PTSD and depression, but that it was also having a negative impact on my life. I mentioned I was angry. I wasn't sleeping. I was drinking more than I should. I was isolating so much that I really had no contact with people outside of work. I didn't know my neighbors. And even at work, I'd keep a lot of people at a distance. But at a certain point, I did learn to accept the diagnosis, and I accepted that I needed to make some really big changes if I wanted things to get better. And what happened was, a few years ago, I embraced mindfulness and art, and these made a huge difference, but it was slow. So today I practice mindfulness every day, art most days. I also swim, which has been a lifesaver, and importantly, I volunteer. I volunteer at the Royal, which is where my healing journey began.
Wow, that honestly, that is amazing, and I think that shows your gratitude to be able to go back to the facility that really helped you out. Do you mind if I ask you a little bit about your art, Peter, and just kind of like, is it painting, is it drawing, is it sculptures? What kind of art are you doing?
Well, mostly oil painting. I've got a couple behind me. I do some photography as well, and also some creative writing, but they all sort of tell a little story for me. The art, my art is different. I distinguish this from art therapy. This is really about envisioning for me a better future for myself, and for me, art is one of those things.
Yeah. Oh, I love the fact, like, I almost meant to comment right when I brought you onto the show. I said, I was going to say, like, what a wonderful backdrop. You've got you win the award tonight for the most colorful, upbeat backdrop. And now to know that you painted that, I think is it's even more inspiring. So you've mentioned that art obviously helps you out. You mentioned the swimming. Are you one of those people, Peter, that it's a day-to-day thing? that every day is its own kind of self-contained thing, and you're just I just got to get through this day, and maybe it's swimming, and maybe it's painting, and maybe it's mindfulness, and I don't know if the mindfulness is just yoga or if it's meditation. But are you one of these people that really pushes the narrative one day at a time?
Yeah, absolutely. It is day to day. And one of the things that gets me through a day is a routine. And so my routine includes mindfulness every morning, swimming when I can. I mean, swimming's fantastic. For me, when I'm in the water, it's one of those places where my head goes quiet. And now I've got tinnitus, and it's the only place where my tinnitus disappears. So swimming is huge. And the thing is, if I didn't have a routine, then I wouldn't get through that sort of day-to-day process, because then I'd be waking up every morning thinking, here we go again, because often it's 50-50 whether I have a good night's sleep. So it's the routine that gets me through, and it is day by day.
Yeah, and sleep is everything, isn't it? Like, I think we can all feel like if you get 8 hours of sleep or you get 2.5 hours of sleep, you can really feel it. I just want to follow up on the tinnitus thing, because I would imagine a lot of your that might be something that a lot of people who worked in armed forces might deal with. It's right. It's the kind of ringing in the ears, and the maybe that comes with the territory. How frustrating is that? I have spoken to people before, Peter, that have had that, and it's really hard to tune that out. Like you said, when you're underwater, it's a nice peaceful moment, but when you're maybe trying to read a book or paint or something, it's there. I would imagine that must be a very frustrating thing for you.
Yeah, it is frustrating because you can't get rid of it, and you can't get away from it. And the worst time of day, in fact, is at night when you're going to sleep. When everything else is quiet, this ringing gets louder. But I learned something else too, the hard way. I've got a few other injuries, so I was taking ibuprofen for some pain and inflammation, and it turns out ibuprofen can actually make tinnitus worse. So I had a spike in tinnitus about 6 months ago, and this made me have to wear the hearing aids, really, that have a tinnitus masking device. But at some point, I think I just had to realize I can't get away from this. I think most people who deal with it have that same issue. Like, you have to find some way to come to terms with it. And for me, again, mindfulness has been one of those things where when I place my attention, without judging it, on this annoying thing that's happening in my head, that if I try to be not judgmental about it and calm about it, it actually does sort of relax. And the noise doesn't go away, but it does go down. And conversely, if I'm experiencing a bout of anxiety, the tinnitus will follow suit.
Wow, honestly, that to me is really fascinating. And I think your ability to, again, try to accept it and live with it, I think is it's admirable. And that, again, Peter, those paintings behind you they're so bright, they're so upbeat, and I think that they paint a perfect picture of where you're at in your journey right now. And I just thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us here about your journey. And we're going to ask you to stick around because I'm sure there might be some questions, but thank you so much for sharing with us here tonight.
Well, thank you.
All right. And again, if you have questions, I mean, my goodness, I probably have 10 or 15 follow-up questions myself, just for Peter from that conversation about tinnitus or his painting or the swimming and some of the things that he's been involved with. By all means, go to the chat section, as I mentioned there, kind of on the right-hand side of your screen, and you'll be able to ask questions. And I don't know, about 15 minutes from now, 10, 15 minutes from now, after we're done with Dr. Lodha, we will be able to take your questions. So by all means, drop them in to the chat feature. Speaking of the aforementioned Dr. Lodha, we're going to bring him in. Dr. Vinay Lodha is a geriatric psychiatrist, clinical lead geriatric outpatient, I believe is the exact title at the Royal. I think I got that right. Dr. Lodha, thank you so much for taking the time here and joining us here at Conversations at the Royal, presented by TD.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity. I am a geriatric psychiatrist. I am not an expert in PTSD, but what I'm going to try and do is just build on what Fardous and Peter have spoken about in the context of what I do on a day-to-day basis. I do I have seen a lot of veterans from the Second World War based on the nature of my practice, and I have seen a number of, not a number, but certainly a fair number of traumatic survivors from war, such as Holocaust victims as well. So maybe I'll just start off by talking about what a geriatric psychiatrist does. So geriatric psychiatrists focus on mental illness in the elderly, and really we try and focus on prevention, evaluation, diagnosis, and treatment. And right now, the elderly is considered 65 and older, but that's changing. As Ian has mentioned, things are constantly changing in the mental health field. And with people living longer and healthier, 65 isn't so old anymore. 20 years ago, 65 was old, and now that's changed, I'd say, to 70 or 75. As psychiatrists, as general psychiatrists, we're taught to conceptualize or formulate patients in the context of biological factors, psychological factors, and social factors. And I'll go through examples of each, and I'll try and relate them to some of what Fardous and Peter were saying, in particular with respect to the theme of PTSD tonight. I just want to highlight too that geriatric psychiatry is an offshoot of psychiatry, and that it was recognized as a subspecialty by the Royal College in 2013. So in talking about frailty, I have lots of words up there, but I'm going to try and get it down to a few kind of nuts and bolts. And just to say, as we get older, we're predisposed to harm with relatively minor insults, and not just physical harm, but also emotional and mental harm. And I'll give some physical examples. We've already talked about hearing, but as we get older, many people suffer from conductive hearing loss. They suffer from vision loss, whether it be macular degeneration or cataracts. As we get older, our bones get more brittle. We lose muscle mass. It puts us at risk for fracture or soft tissue injury. But just to relate it to PTSD and anxiety, as we get older too, as our frontal lobes change in our brain, and our frontal lobes are kind of the biggest lobes of our brain. They're what makes us human, allow us to plan, but also allow us to suppress anxiety. So when we have anxiety, or when we're thinking about something potentially traumatic, we often, when we're younger, we have cognitive strategies to suppress that anxiety such that it's not functionally impairing. And we certainly know that as we get older and as our frontal lobes start to change a little bit, sometimes that anxiety balloons up or comes out where it may have not been a problem earlier on. So again, that fits into the concept of frailty, or a biological change that we're focused on when we're looking at older people. Psychologically, there are lots of things we can talk about, but I really like Erik Erikson, and Erik Erikson went through these stages of personality development, and to focus on his last stage, he talks about integrity versus despair. That when you reach the end of your life, can you look back on your life and say, hey, that was okay. I'm happy with where it's at. Can I approach the mortality of my life thinking I'm comfortable with where I'm at? Or do you despair with respect to, I have lots of regrets, there's things I could have done differently, or I'm not happy about how certain things came out in my life. So again, another one of the psychological factors that we look at when we're approaching older people. I just want to highlight social issues too. And again, psychiatry is the mix of biological, psychological, and social to really look to improve people's qualities of life, right? We're trying to put these things together to improve quality of life. And I just, as I've done this for a while, I look at the social issues older people face. Retirement often is a transition where people have to establish a new sense of meaning or sense of purpose in life. And that sense of meaning and purpose, if it's not addressed, can often lead to anxiety, worry about what am I going to do now, fear about what am I going to do now, or often signs of depression or despair that I don't have a purpose or I don't have a meaning. Death of a spouse is a common social problem that happens in older people, and that we often lose our best friend later in life, and that's a major issue social issue to overcome. And again, the rates are up there on the slide. The final thing I'd like to highlight is, I've moved, I'm in my mid-40s. I've moved maybe three or four big moves in my life. and they were stressful, and they took me kind of a year to adjust to every move. And as we get older, if you can think about it, as you get physically frailer and mentally frailer, if you have 3 or 4 moves within the span of 5 years, you can see how that stress can potentially predispose people to mental illness. Just one other point, just to highlight the importance of geriatric psychiatry, and our older population is the fastest growing population, or fastest segment, is the fastest growing segment of our population currently, and it's for 2 reasons. People are living longer. Life expectancy has doubled. It used to be about 50 in 1900, and it's doubled to about 80 in the year 2000, 2010. And the other important thing to highlight is the baby boomers are just coming through. So we're right at the peak of the baby boom in terms of older people in the 65 to 75 range.
Yeah, listen, and I feel like, Dr. Lodha, I feel like you can just go right through it. I don't even know if you need me for this, to be honest with you. You're this is so informative, and it's moving along. And listen, I'll ask you the question because it's there, and I think everybody can see it on the screen. But you kind of touched on it there. Some of the main diagnoses that you see in your field.
Yeah, so there are 3 main diagnoses that we see in geriatric psychiatry. One is dementia, or major neurocognitive disorder. It describes a group of symptoms that affect memory, thinking, social abilities, that interfere with everyday life. Alzheimer's disease is the most common one. Often folks who have experienced trauma, and I'll just I think when you've experienced a trauma or experienced PTSD or an anxiety or mood disorder, it often follows you throughout your entire life, and it's something you manage your entire life. When we have dementias, often we see those symptoms peak or get worse when we lose those cognitive or functional abilities to kind of suppress them. The other 2 major diagnoses that we see is depression, major depressive disorder, which I know has been talked about in conversations a lot, and again, characterized by depressed mood and loss of pleasure, and some of the symptoms are listed below. And then finally, delirium. Delirium is again generally an inability to sustain attention that's due to a medical issue. It comes on suddenly, and if you treat the medical issue, the delirium can generally go away. I just want to spend a moment talking about prevention, because it's great to talk about treatments, but I really want to focus on prevention, particularly for the most devastating illness that I see, which is dementia. And I didn't know Peter was going to talk about his tinnitus. And it really makes me think about risk factors for dementia. And I really like this slide, a great article from the British Medical Journal. And essentially, if there's one thing that you can control to really prevent your onset of dementia in midlife, or from kind of your late 20s to your 60s, it's actually protecting your hearing. We don't know the exact reasons why, but the ability to protect your hearing is huge with respect to dementia prevention. The other piece I'd like to point out is physical activity. Although they're saying it can reduce risk of dementia with physical activity kind of in later life, if you look at all these issues, whether it be blood pressure, diabetes, social isolation, if you're doing lots of physical activity early in your life, you're more likely to be more educated, you're more likely to control your blood pressure, you're more likely to not be obese, you're more likely not to smoke. So I just want to really put in a plug for physical exercise as a treatment for many psychiatric illnesses, but in particular as prevention for dementia, and as prevention and treatment for mood disorders, and I'd argue anxiety disorders as well.
Isn't it amazing though, Dr. Lodha, and it doesn't matter almost and what you're talking about, but physical activity is crucial at any stage, even from teenagers needing to be physically active to people that you see in kind of the geriatric field. It's vitally important, isn't it?
I mean, I could spend an hour talking about physical activity, but I'll just say 3 things. I mean, physical activity is as good. And I'll talk about the type of physical activity in just a moment. But Physical activity is as good as antidepressants for mild to moderate depression. Probably better, probably better. And the physical activity that we're talking about is stuff that raises your heart rate, increases your core temperature, causes a little bit of muscle soreness. So we're pushing blood through the vessels, right? So if you think purely from a plumbing perspective, we're keeping the vessels flexible, right? We're pushing more oxygen and nutrients to your brain. People who physically exercise, their brains can actually grow and their overall brain weight is increased. The hippocampus, or the main area of the brain involved in memory or the ability to form a new memory, can increase in size with physical activity. So there are huge physical links to physical activity and brain health. And arguably in PTSD, it's your amygdala that gets kind of fried, or that portion of the brain. And physical exercise is a way to allow for some healing within that center portion of the brain. I want to really make an emphasis on hearing, because we don't know a lot about this. Protect your hearing. Protect your hearing, because of all the modifiable risk factors we know for dementia, by protecting your hearing, you can certainly reduce it by about 10%. Your risk of dementia by 10%. And that to me is really significant. And it's something I don't think a lot of people are aware of. Exercise. So I've already kind of gone over my little spiel about exercise that I often tell the patients, but it reduces anxiety, depression, and negative mood by improving self-esteem and cognitive function. So I tell my patients, I tell my students that when they rotate through, you will get smarter if you exercise. Your concentration is better, your memory is better, and this has been shown in standardized testing as well. And the optimal number seems to be about 150 minutes per week. And so about 30 minutes, five times a week. And again, I don't want to say it's not going for a walk, because if you can walk and that's what you can do, that's great. But it's pushing yourself a little bit. It's maybe just breaking that sweat. So if you can push yourself or push out of your comfort zone, it's really good. So I kind of have gotten off script. I'm sorry, Ian.
No, I'm telling you, this is like I said, I don't even feel like I'm needed here. I think you're just doing such a great job of going through the slides. Just carry on. This is very informative and compelling from my.
Sorry, I probably over rehearsed. I kind of think this is kind of like an exam, so I've got like all the points I want to make quick. But I'm talking about exercise with respect to preventing depressive disorders. So you know, exercise is as good for mild to moderate depression as antidepressants, and arguably improves overall brain health in a lot of physical ways, including reducing cortisol levels in your brain. Exercise again increases blood flow to your brain as well, which is good for your brain. I want to talk a little bit about meditation in terms of a way to prevent depression. And meditation doesn't have to be a stereotypical yoga. I think Peter described it beautifully. When he swims, everything kind of goes away. And meditation, again, it triggers it allows your brain to shut off. And we all need our brains at times to shut off with all the noise that we have. And meditation occurs, I feel, during exercise. When people talk about being in the zone or in the moment, when you can block everything out, that to me is a meditative moment. Even reading, like when you get into a book where nothing can distract you, that to me is a form of meditation. So it's not something that necessarily needs to be you don't necessarily need a formal program. I mean, meditation stuff helps, but it's that being in the moment. Dancing, people who dance often talk about being lost in dancing. My daughter dances, and I can see that she forgets about everything when she's taking a dancing lesson. The final thing I want to talk about is journaling, and this as a prevention method for depression. And that is, if something happens, or if you talk about, if you recall something that gives you a good feeling or a good moment, and you're able to look back on it 6 months later or a year later or 2 years later, and reminisce or get that feeling back that you originally had when you had that moment, that's a way that's very protective to your brain with respect to depression, and anxiety. And I just wanted to go through a concrete way that I try and practice these three things to prevent depression. So exercise, we're fortunate enough in Ottawa to have so many lakes nearby. So getting into a couple of boats with my family and paddling. I force them to hike, even though my kids sometimes get mad at me. They're meditative moments when you hike, and there's something about outside exercise versus inside exercise. I recently finished a book called The Nature Fix, and nature, when you're doing exercise outside, it has kind of a bit of a different effect on your brain than when you're doing it inside. So not all exercise is created equal, and not all settings of exercise are created equal too. But you can certainly have meditative moments outside where you're really grounded in the place and the moment. And then finally, Facebook is how my generation journals these days. So one of the things, I mean, Facebook has lots of problems, but one of the things about social media that's really interesting is if you have a great moment, I love the fact that this moment will pop up on my feed 2 years from now or 3 years from now saying, I had a great day with my kids, I got exercise in, and I remember that moment as something that brings me back to that feeling. I'm going to just switch gears here and talk about dementia, because dementia is probably the hardest illness that I see in my practice. And it's a really devastating illness. And I think if you have a little bit of knowledge ahead of time for both you and your loved ones, it can often help go through the process. But the big tragedy of dementia is that people physically stay alive, but the essence of who they are passes away. Often towards the severe to endpoints of dementia, you often don't recognize loved ones. You're not able to do your activities of daily living, which are toileting, dressing, bathing, feeding. That often comes as dementia progresses. Toileting is the number one reason why or incontinence is the number one reason why people end up in long-term care. And we know what COVID did to populations in long-term care over the last couple of years. So, the other tragedy of dementia is you lose your consciousness. You lose your ability to be self-aware and aware of those around you gradually and insidiously. And often towards the end of dementias, family members suffer more than the patient who has dementia. And why I'm bringing this up is I think it's really important when you're well to look at quality of life versus length of life issues. And again, quality of life is a very subjective thing that everybody has their own interpretation to. And I'm skewed by my own experiences. I see the worst of dementia. So my view of quality of life may be very different than someone else's view of quality of life. But I do believe in autonomy. And I do believe that everybody should talk to family members about allowing powers of attorneys to know what their wishes are. It's really important too to talk about do not resuscitate orders in terms of if you or a loved one develop a dementia, how much medical intervention do you want? To me, psychiatry is about looking at treating quality of life and optimizing quality of life. And sometimes that means letting go. And often when we have patients with dementia towards the severe and end stages, when there's good palliative care or when they're looked after well at the end of life, it is often comforting for the patient, but it's also comforting for the family as well, in the sense that it provides a lot of relief to the family. And in geriatrics, we treat families as much as we treat the patients, and that's similar, I think, with the PTSD group or at the Royal. So again, try and have these discussions ahead of time. I've probably gone a bit over time, so I'll stop and pass it back to Ian.
Yeah, listen, Dr. Lodha, you mentioned that you had prepared for this, overly prepared. I think I always tell my kids, I tell them about the 5 Ps. I tell them prior preparation prevents poor performances. And I think you were exhibit A of that, because you were locked and loaded and took us right through that. And it was really informative. And I learned so much just I had no idea of the correlation between hearing and dementia and some of those things. So this was really eye-opening and really fascinating. And I know that it has probably ended up with some questions from our audience. So once again, jump into the chat. And as I've said before, we're going to keep Dr. Lodha here. We're going to bring Peter and Fardous back into the mix here. We've got some questions from the community here. So let's kind of get into some of these questions as we bring everybody back in to wrap up this show. And there we go. There's the fourth shot I was looking for. Let me start with this. In fact, I'll start with this question from Sarah, because Dr. Lodha, I think I was kind of probably like Sarah listening to you speak. I had no idea about the correlation between kind of our auditory systems and dementia. So the question from Sarah is, I had no idea about protecting your hearing. Is it too late to fix the damage if you're in your 30s?
I think the research on this is still evolving. But what I would say this is, if you can optimize your hearing, if you can do things to optimize your hearing and protect your hearing. So I remember in my 20s, early 20s, I used to go to concerts and my ears would ring after going to a concert or being in a really loud venue. And I'm sure veterans who have heard loud sounds have hearing issues again that from the loud sounds. But anything you can do to protect your hearing and optimize the hearing that you have, I think will be protective. We're not sure if the hearing impairment itself causes a lack of stimulation to the brain and hence a deterioration. But protecting your hearing and optimizing your hearing is really, really important, even in your 30s, and making sure that if you do have some hearing damage, that you avoid situations that could make it worse, such as really loud settings. And if you need hearing aids, optimize your hearing to the best of your ability. And I do think in the future, the way technology is moving and the way research is moving, that there could be solutions to hearing impairment that we don't know now that will certainly be available in the future. So what we do know, though, is if you do have hearing problems, you're at a much, much higher risk of cognitive impairment. And not just cognitive impairment, like, for example, people who have vision difficulties, they're at a high risk of delirium. So sensory impairment itself puts you at risk of psychiatric illness.
Okay, that's, again, very helpful and useful information. I got a couple of questions here. We've got questions for everybody. Peter, I'll slide over to you with a couple. The first one's from Claude. And I'll be honest with you, Peter, I almost asked you this question at the end, and I'm glad that Claude, it's the old great minds think alike. Claude wants to know, Peter, is your art for sale?
Kind of. Yeah, it's taken some courage to actually put myself out there, and I have started to sell my art. Right now, it's being sold at the Royal, so that some of the proceeds go back to the foundation. So, short answer, I'm working on it.
Okay, well, you've got at least a couple of customers watching you here this evening. Then the other question for you, Peter, you touched on the swimming and the mindfulness and the painting. Andrea wants to know a little bit more about your mindfulness routine.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that one, because I think mindfulness is important, but it's also misunderstood. And I think I'll tell you about my routine, but let me just tell you, the thing is, a lot of people think that mindfulness is about stopping your brain from thinking. Well, you can't do that. Your brain's going to think whether you like it or not. That's just a biological function. But what you can do is sort of separate yourself from your thinking. You can recognize that you actually have a choice whether or not you want to engage with the thoughts or not. And that's where the peace and the quiet come from. To sort of sit back and be able to watch your thoughts pass by without actually engaging in the what ifs and what should I do next, and so that's that. And then the other thing is, I think a lot of people think that mindfulness, like meditation, is something you practice on a cushion in a corner in a quiet room, and that's certainly one way to do it. But the whole point to practicing is so that you can get out in the world and practice mindfulness, so that you can find that quiet space while you're driving or while you're having a conversation. Even you can still be alert and aware, but not so engaged in your thoughts you're not mindful of the present moment. So my routine right now is I spend an hour every morning before breakfast because it does take practice so that you can remember even to be mindful during your busy day. And then after that, it's really just practicing as I go about my business.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Okay, Fardous, we're going to try asking you a question. There might be an audio issue. So before I ask the question to you, Fardous, I want to see if I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
There we go. We can hear you. This is good. So you know what, Fardous, I feel like this question here from Glenda, it's not directed to anybody. I think this is in your realm. If it's not, just tell me, and maybe we can get Dr. Lodha, or we can tackle this in another way. But here's a question from Glenda, who said, this past week I heard the term CPTSD for the first time. That is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Could you maybe explain what differentiates that from regular PTSD?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that on, and thank you for the question, Glenda. This is something that we've heard a lot from our veterans about this, and they're similar to moral injury and PTSD. There's some similarities. In complex post-traumatic stress disorder and PTSD, you see experiences of flashbacks, of nightmares, insomnia, and both, have conditions that make you feel intensely afraid and unsafe. But the key difference here is, the frequency of the trauma. So while PTSD is caused by a single traumatic event, complex post-traumatic stress disorder is caused by long-lasting trauma that continues or repeats for months, even years. So this is more referred to as complex trauma. So it's really about the frequency and the duration that differentiates the two. So if you're continuously being hit with that traumatic event, unfortunately, that can lead to CPTSD.
Excellent. That is well explained. Another one here for Peter. This one is from Kelly. Peter, what would be the best mental health advice you could give to a future member of the armed forces? So again, what could you? And you know what, Peter? One of the really cool things I love. There's a great feature out there where celebrities and prominent people will go back and write a letter to themselves. Like go back and write a letter to yourself. The 14-year-old version of you or the 18-year-old version of you. And I always think that's such a neat concept. So I guess in a way, Kelly is sort of maybe asking you to go back, and you talked about being a Carleton student and then getting into the, into the armed forces. And maybe is there some advice you'd wish you could go back and give yourself, or a piece of advice you could give somebody who's kind of in their late teens, early 20s, just getting into the armed forces right now?
Wow, it's a challenge because, I do have some advice that I would give myself. I'm just not so sure that myself 20 years ago would have listened. But anyway, here we go. I think the biggest challenge for me, and I think a lot of veterans, is that when you leave, when you take your uniform off, you have this incredible sense of loss. Like, who am I? Who am I now? What am I going to do? What am I going to do that's meaningful or purposeful? And so that took me, I would say, a lot of years to really get through. And I know some guys never do. And in fact, you hear this thought among veterans that, once you leave the Army, you'll never be a civilian. I'm a veteran. So there's this sense where you're stuck between two worlds. You're not in the military anymore, but you can't ever be a civilian. So the difficulty really has to do with finding meaning and purpose, and finding some sort of new identity that you can build for yourself afterwards. And I really strongly believe that the best way you can do that is to start thinking about having some kind of outlet outside your job. I don't think it's just for the military. I think this probably applies to a lot of people. You need to have something besides your job that gives you meaning.
Excellent. Yeah, that's, again, great advice, and I think that's applicable for a lot of people, and it's not just people who take off their, the military clothing. It's people that change jobs and careers, and they have these identity crises. That I think that's great advice for anybody here that's listening. I know we've pretty much gone right to the top of the hour, so why don't I end with this? I got a final question here from Jennifer for Dr. Lodha. And I think this is a great question, because Dr. Lodha, you talked about how that baby boomer population is aging, and for a lot of us, our parents are getting into that age, and there's dementia issues that we might think might be prevalent for them. Jennifer wants to know, Dr. Lodha, if I think my mom may have dementia, what's the first step in getting her some help?
So wonderful question. I think there are a number of ways to approach it, but the very first step in getting her help, I think, would be talking to her and asking her if she's noticed any memory difficulties and if she's noticed any changes in her function, and using that as a springboard to say that maybe you've noticed some changes in her memory and that it'd be worthwhile getting checked out. You can go to your family doctor. We at the Royal are a geriatric psychiatry program, and we service the entire LHIN. We have so we would certainly that's something we would definitely see and assess if a family doctor made a referral. But I think a lot of times dementias aren't diagnosed until 4 years after they actually start. So that's the average. Is people usually have symptoms for about 4 years prior to a diagnosis being made. So it's really important to have that open conversation with the family member, trying to be compassionate, yet also saying that you've noticed a change. And until someone realizes, or the hope is that if someone realizes there's something going on, that they can seek out the appropriate help.
That is perfect advice, and that is a perfect place for us to leave it, because, like I said, we've gone just past the hour, and time really flies when you're engaged in learning, as I did from the three of you, and I'm sure our audience did this evening. So we'll just kind of go clockwise here and say, Fardous and Dr. Lodha and Peter, thank you so much for all of you for taking little 15-minute chunks and talking to us about your experiences and then answering these questions. It was invaluable to have the three of you part of this conversation. So thank you to the three of you. And before we wrap up here, I want to just direct your attention to the bottom of your screen. Some really neat events happening for the Royal. Some opportunities where maybe you can get out and support the Royal. Like Peter was saying, he does, some of the proceeds for his paintings go back to the Royal. There are so many ways you can give back to the Royal. So we really encourage you to do that if you were moved after listening to these three speakers today. So thank you, everybody, for taking the time to tune in. We want to let you know that our next conversations at the Royal, it's all about caregiver stress at the holidays, and that's obviously going to be coming up in December, and I think that's a great topic, because obviously you can feel the stress sometimes gets up and around the last week of December for a lot of people. So I'm sure that will be an invaluable conversation as well. So watch for your invitation to that session to come into your email at some point in the weeks ahead. Until then, thank you so much again for joining us, and we want you to stay safe.